The first thing that you do when you arrive, after you've thrown off your life jacket, is to pull out this small plastic package, about A5 in size. You start hacking into it with a knife. Your smartphone is inside. Once you've got that out, you grab a couple of your friends and you go and take a selfie with the boat. You use a selfie stick if you've got one. Actually, a lot of people do. And then you take that photograph and you send it to your friends and your family back home to let them know that you've made it. Now, this is a real-life situation for many refugees, and yet it challenges our images about what a refugee is like. That somebody who's fleeing their country because of war is necessarily poor, that they lack agency, and to a certain extent, that they lack any meaningful personality. A refugee with a selfie stick is kind of difficult to imagine, right? But I've seen it myself. So in August, I spent 2 weeks traveling from the Greek island of Lesbos, over sea and then overland through Greece and the Balkans, Hungary, Austria, and Germany, following the route that many people have taken from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond, as they flee towards safety in Europe. When I did that trip, it was part of the research for a project called Migration Watch, which I'm doing as part of a Wired the Space Creative Innovation Fellowship. And the final output from that is going to be a 10-day-long data visualization, which is going to follow people's journeys in real time, as well as a podcast that looks at the wider issues. Along the way, I spoke with many refugees and migrants, with volunteers, activists, local government officials, and I was constantly challenged and surprised by what I learned. Now, I come from an island, Britain, and that's given me a very particular sense of what a border is. Because in the UK, the country stops where the sea starts. But it turns out that that physical barrier is only one way of thinking about what a border is. And as I shared the refugees' journey into Europe, I learned a lot about what borders mean to them. So when you first arrive in Lesbos, you have to walk along the coast about 10 kilometers to the first town, Molavos. And you come to a car park at the edge of the town where there's volunteers who have water and sandwiches. And from here, you can get on a bus to the capital, Mytilene, which is where you can register and get papers. Now, naturally, when people arrive, they're quite tired, and so many people will ask, well, where can I find a hotel? The trouble is that without papers, you can't go to a hotel, and you can't use public transport, and you can't take a taxi. That's one of the ways that countries enforce their borders, by refusing access to services to people who don't have the right papers, like refugees who've just landed and who haven't yet registered with the authorities. And so that night of arrival, many people lie down on the ground to sleep, on the gravel of the car park, while they wait for the bus that'll come in the morning, because they simply aren't allowed to do anything else. So what do these borders look like? And I don't mean the regular checkpoints, but the rest of the border that goes through the countryside. Well, it turns out that it's actually very porous, with little sign that you're about to move from one country into another. Right through the Balkans, refugees aren't allowed to use the official checkpoints, again, because they don't have the papers that would allow them to do so. And so to cross from Greece into Macedonia, people take a route that's about 4 kilometers to the west of the official checkpoint. A tarmac road ends, and there's a dirt patch next to a cornfield alongside a railway line, where 2 Macedonian policemen have a gazebo that keeps them out of the sun and the rain. There's also a burger van. And from here, small groups of refugees can cross the border into Macedonia and walk to Jevgeli, the first town, which is where they can take a train further north. When I crossed this border, it was on a train traveling from Thessaloniki in the north of Greece through to Belgrade in Serbia. As we passed through the countryside, we could see the small groups of people walking through the fields on either side of the railway line. And then, as we pulled into Jevgeli station, there were 1,000 people standing on the platform. Now, the police had been holding back the crowd of refugees from the train, but once the Macedonian border control had returned our passports to us, they locked us inside our carriage, and they opened the doors to the 2 carriages behind so that the refugees could board. There was this huge surge forward in the crowd as everyone tried to make sure that they got on the train. I saw one man passing his 2-year-old daughter through the train windows and then managed to scramble up behind her just to escape the scrum at the door. And then finally the train ready to depart and the doors were closed. But we could see through the glass doors in the vestibule through to the carriage where the refugees were, and it looked like a commuter train at rush hour. There were still empty seats in our carriage. Now, if you have a European passport and you wish to be brought face to face with your own privilege, I suggest that you get on that train from Thessaloniki to Belgrade. A group of us had watched with a growing sense of unease as all of this unfolded. And as we pulled away from the station in Jevgeli, I felt sick to my stomach. But back to these borders. If they're so insubstantial, how do you find them? How do you know where to go? Well, one way is that the people who've gone before you tell you where to go. They tell you where the paths are. And the other is that you use Google Maps on your smartphone. And that's how this group of people found their way from Serbia into Hungary once they'd finished charging their phone with their mini solar panel. Hungary ought to be the place where this story about borders ends, because it's the first country in the Schengen zone. Or at least it's the first country in that zone that has a land border with another Schengen country. It's also the place where you can get on a long-distance train to Germany or to Sweden or elsewhere in Northern Europe. Now, since August, a lot of countries have reinstated border controls, but back then, and still now to a certain extent, Hungary and Budapest were major milestones along the way. When I arrived in Kaleti station at 8 p.m. one summer evening, ready to take the onward train to Munich, the entire station was crowded with people, with refugees, and there was a 6-hour queue for the international ticket office. Now, naturally, the onward train was packed. There were people standing and sitting as best they could, right down the narrow corridor, ready for the overnight trip to Germany. I think for a lot of people, that was a pretty uncomfortable night. And then at 6 o'clock the next morning, we were woken up at Rosenheim, just south of here, which is where the German police boarded the train to check passports. They were probably the gentlest, friendliest police I have ever seen. But still, everybody that didn't have papers was asked to leave the train, about 100 people or so, to get on a waiting bus that would take them to the asylum reception centre. And on the one hand, you could feel reasonably comfortable because, people had arrived at the place that they wanted to get to. But on the other, those of us who were left on the train were again given pause to think about what it means to have a European passport and to travel with such ease, with borders as no barriers to living our everyday lives. I'd like to bring you back to this image now of the Syrian refugees who've just arrived on Lesbos, and to ask you to contrast that with the images that we've come to expect of refugees, of tired, hungry, desperate people. And it's not that refugees can't be all of those things. And certainly, as winter is approaching and still people are making that journey through Greece and the Balkans, we're seeing increasing amounts of suffering. The reason that I bring you back to this image, though, is that I think that increasingly we expect people to look and to act in a certain way in order to be deemed worthy of our help and support. And if we insist on only helping those who fall below a certain level of vulnerability, we create a race to the bottom where soon no one is deserving of support. The other thing is that the help that's offered to refugees is often seen mainly in the short term. It's bottles of water and blankets and tents. And while all of those things can be life-saving in the immediate term, seen from the long-term perspective of a refugee who needs to rebuild their life, they're somewhat lacking. Refugees' lives are more complex than we usually give them credit for. When somebody leaves their home, they're looking not just for a place of safety, but for a new home and a job and a community that they can be part of and contribute to. And we have a responsibility here, because that right to remain in safety and to be part of a community that embraces them is in our gift. Thank you.